Last year, this channel released a video on Grim Fandango for Dias de los Muertos that year. While that video is one that I ultimately enjoy, there was a major aspect of the game's narrative that was not discussed within it. This is not so much an oversight as something that was intentionally left hanging. It didn't truly fit within the scope of that video's focus on the thematic trappings of noir that Grim Fandango explores. This aforementioned aspect is the two kinds of communists and the two kinds of communism that the game portrays as part of its political satire. To preface these thoughts, I will make something explicitly clear. Grim Fandango is a game made by liberals for liberals. I'm not intending to say that the creators were any modicum of politically savvy, or that the game really intended any of the ideas that I'm going to go into. With that out of the way, the interpretation is still fairly clear within the game's text. Grim Fandango draws the line between aesthetic communism and practical communism explicitly, and a divide that I've yet to see another game tackle, Disco Elysium aside. Let's begin by defining what I mean by aesthetic communism and practical communism. Aesthetic communism is largely the space of communists in the West, where communism isn't an ideology so much as it is a vibe, a signifier of being cool. In other words, Trotskyism. Practical communism is what we see in the global South and in the East. It's a term used to describe the successful revolutions in those areas of the world. The aesthetic communist rejects these revolutions and emphasizes their flaws. They see socialism as utopian, something that can be attained but only through utterly perfect conditions that don't line up with the material reality. After all, if it can't truly be attained within the conditions they live in, then they are not held accountable for it being unattained, for that accountability would lead to them losing their status as beneficiaries of capital. This is portrayed quite succinctly through Grim Fandango, if unintentionally, but to get to that dichotomy, the context needs to be set. Early on in the game, Manny Calavera, our protagonist, is introduced to Salvador, a revolutionary figure obviously styled after Che Guevara. It's through him that much of the game's wider conflict outside of Manny progresses, the revolution against the death industry. Grim Fandango takes place in an afterlife where your travel to your final resting place, past the limbo that is the game's setting, is determined by what you're able to afford. It's a profit-driven system that monopolizes on the lives of people, and Salvador seeks to deconstruct it entirely at its source through his underground operation, where he risks his life every day. He is, ironically, the ideal practical communist, even though he represents a person who is unfortunately often used solely as vapid aestheticism despite his practical beliefs. This is where our stand-in for practical communism comes into play, but the aesthetic communist enters the picture a fair bit after this. Toward the end of this first section of the game, after meeting and assisting Salvador for the first time, Manny's quest brings him to the town of Rubalcaba, where he spends a year of his life. The second section of the game depicts his departure from Rubalcaba, and it's during his attempt to leave that he goes to the Blue Casket Cafe. The Blue Casket is a club full of supposed socialists who don't have any material experience or knowledge, aesthetic communists. They talk about communism in vague ways that don't actually mean anything to anyone, ways that don't actually engage with the ideology. They may read the text, or at the very least pretend to, but they don't internalize any of the meanings. The owner of the cafe is a woman named Olivia, who is the stand-in for this ideological positionality. Though it is fairly distasteful how this game disparages poetry as an art form in order to get her vapid nature across, painting it as if all poems attempting to be subtle are nonsense, and it is rather misogynistic at how it portrays her lust for power through her dating men solely as a status symbol, the message she and her patrons send in the text is clear. The Blue Casket engages with revolutionary ideology and artistic craft as solely aesthetic objects. The ultimate objectification of revolutionary thought by the Blue Casket and Olivia comes in the fourth and final section of the game. Manny's return to El Mero, where the game began, brings him back to Rubalcaba. Here he learns that Olivia and Salvador have begun dating, Olivia taking ownership over Salvador, literally fetishizing him in his revolution. Upon the return to El Mero, where Salvador and Olivia hatch a plan with Manny and his friends to dethrone the death industry once and for all, she kills Salvador, betrays him in an opportunist bid to gain status within the death industry. After all, communism was simply a way of gaining more capital to her, the Blue Casket a place only of aesthetics to profit off of. She's a liberal opportunist through and through, as so many self-proclaimed revolutionaries have turned out to be. As Salvador dies, he takes her out with him, at the very least winning the ideological war. Grim Fandango is a very simple game on the surface. It's largely comedically driven without much to speak of in terms of ideology, and most of the depth that can be plumbed is more in its reinvention of the noir aestheticism themes that it adores so much. but there is an interesting dichotomy present within its text, one born from a simple neoliberal parody of communists that, in practice, ends up becoming an interesting and tragic look at the two different sides of communism, aesthetic and practical, one that seeks solely to impress and gain power, and one that actually wants to make the world a better place. This has been Arcade Everlasting, who thinks forcing the worker bees to unionize in Grim Fandango is one of the better jokes in the game's main progression. Signing off. Thank you for watching.